The galaxy has a way of forgetting what it was never allowed to remember. After Endor, when the Emperor's reign collapsed in a single night above a forest moon, the historians got to work. They catalogued the dead. They recorded the battles. They named the admirals, the Moffs, the intelligence directors who had spent decades building the machinery of imperial rule. But there were gaps, quiet ones, places in the record where something should have been and simply wasn't. The Emperor's most private service had no official name, no public charter, no building on Coruscant with a sign above the door. It existed in the space between official imperial power and the things that official imperial power could never be seen doing. And the moment the Emperor stopped breathing, it dissolved. Not gradually, not through bureaucratic decommissioning. It dissolved the way a held breath releases, completely and all at once. Files gone, mission logs overwritten, the coded manifests that might have told you who these people were, where they had operated, what they had done across 2 decades of imperial rule. Erased, carefully and completely erased. What the Empire left behind in its collapse was enormous. Fleets still in formation, weapons caches on 100 outer rim worlds, occupation infrastructure that would take the New Republic years to dismantle. The physical weight of imperial power was everywhere, impossible to ignore, impossible to miss. What it did not leave behind was her. She was already erased before anyone thought to look. Her name didn't appear in any official record. There were people on Coruscant who had sat across tables from her, received transmissions through her, felt the specific weight of her presence in a room, and who still couldn't have described her face if asked directly. Not because she was unremarkable, quite the opposite. But she had been trained from an age too young to fully understand the training in the art of presence without permanence. You noticed her when she needed you to. When she didn't, she was simply part of the atmosphere, part of the background, the slightly wrong feeling you couldn't name on the walk home that night. That wasn't carelessness. It was craftsmanship. Years of it. The most fundamental skill she had ever been taught. More fundamental even than combat or languages or the Force. The ability to move through the world and leave no impression behind that she had not deliberately chosen to leave. The galaxy didn't mourn her. It couldn't mourn what it had never been permitted to know existed. But she existed. Fully. Completely. She was alive in the wreckage of the only world she had ever understood, standing in the aftermath of a collapse she had not caused and could not have prevented, holding the pieces of an identity that had been built entirely around a man who was now gone. What comes next is the story of what that cost her, and what, against every reasonable expectation, it eventually gave back. Palpatine had many instruments, advisors who shaped imperial policy from the shadows, enforcers who moved through the outer rim with the full weight of imperial authority behind them, inquisitors bred specifically to hunt Force sensitives and feed them into the imperial machine, naval officers who had spent careers earning the right to command fleets that could reduce cities to silence in an afternoon. The Emperor's hands were something categorically different from all of these. They didn't hold titles. They didn't appear on organizational charts. They didn't receive promotions or file reports through official channels, or attend briefings in rooms full of other people who knew what they were. They existed in a category so private, so deliberately isolated from every other layer of imperial power, that most of the Empire's own senior leadership had no idea they existed at all. And they were not recruited, they were chosen. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Because the choosing wasn't a military selection process. It wasn't an intelligence recruitment with assessments and interviews and background checks. It reached back through the Sith lineage into practices centuries old, something that predated the Empire, predated the Republic that came before it, reaching back into a tradition of identifying and claiming certain minds at certain moments, done through the Force itself, by a man who had spent a lifetime learning to read not what someone was in the present, but what they could become under the right sustained and systematic pressure. He was extraordinarily patient. Most people who encountered Palpatine in his political life mistook the patience for passivity. It was never passivity. It was the confidence of someone who had already decided how things would go and was simply waiting for the timeline to catch up. He was willing to wait years, sometimes decades, for something he had already determined would happen. Mara Jade was found young. Exactly how young is a matter that no surviving record answers cleanly. The documents that might have told you the date, the location, the circumstances, they are among the things that no longer exist. But the fragments of her own later accounts, in the rare moments she spoke of this period at all, suggest she was taken before the age of 5, taken from her family, or placed with the Emperor's agents by her family. The accounts differ. She herself never resolved it with certainty, and there is something quietly devastating about that. A woman who spent her entire life in possession of extraordinary intelligence, who could reconstruct the layout of a building from a single glance and recall conversations word for word years later, who never managed to answer the most basic question of her own beginning. Whatever the truth of that first chapter, the effect was the same. She grew up inside the Emperor's court, with no memory of a life before it. No framework that would have allowed her to understand that what was being done to her was not, in fact, the normal shape of a human life. There was nothing to compare it to. No outside reference. No other version of childhood available to her as a contrast. It was simply what life was. And she moved through it with the adaptability of someone who had never been given the option of moving through it any other way. The instructors who shaped her early years are, like almost everything else about this period, anonymous. Names erased, records gone. What remains is only the outline of what they produced, which was, by any honest measure, extraordinary. She was learning combat before most children her age had learned to read in more than one language. Not as a sport or a discipline in the traditional sense, as a complete physical education in controlled lethality. Hand-to-hand first, built from the ground up, with an emphasis on economy of movement and the precise application of force. Then vibro weapons, then blasters, and eventually the integration of all of it into a single fluid system. The body, not as a collection of trained skills, but as one complete instrument. She was educated simultaneously in the politics and culture of dozens of worlds. Multiple languages, not learned sequentially, but in parallel. Absorbed through immersive instruction that left her fluent rather than functional. The protocols of imperial courts. The operating cultures of criminal organizations. The social architecture of merchant guilds and mining consortiums, and planetary governments across the core, the mid-rim, the outer territories. All of it learned with equal depth, all of it equally available. And she learned to become other people, not as a surface performance, not the kind of cover identity that most operatives maintain with conscious effort and shed with relief at the end of an operation. What she was taught went deeper. She learned to build a complete psychological architecture around an assumed identity, a full interior life for the person she was pretending to be, their memories, their habits, their emotional responses, their specific way of moving through a conversation. She could inhabit this construction for months at a time, without the performance becoming visible at the seams. She could return from being someone else to being herself, and carry nothing back with her that didn't belong. The Emperor found her before she had a self to protect. That timing was not incidental. It was the entire foundation of the design. The Force training was different from everything else, more intimate, more direct, conducted in its most significant moments by Palpatine himself. What he taught her was not the Force as the Jedi Order had understood and practiced it. There was no philosophy here, no framework of compassion or surrender, no instruction in the relationship between the living Force and the deeper current that moved beneath all things. The Jedi tradition, with its emphasis on stillness, on releasing personal desire, on service as an expression of connection to something larger than the self, would have been genuinely unrecognizable to the girl being trained in that court. What she was given was something sharper and more immediately useful. The Force, as she was taught it, was a set of tools, precise, powerful, dangerous tools, to be maintained under absolute control and deployed with absolute precision. Nothing more, and nothing demanded to be nothing less. She learned to feel through it, to extend her awareness outward into a room and read the emotional landscape of everyone present. Fear, deception, confidence that was genuine versus confidence that was performed. The micro-tension in someone's body in the moment before they chose to draw a weapon or run. She learned to use it in combat, enhancing the speed and precision of movements that were already extraordinary by any physical standard. She learned to suppress her own signature in the Force, to make herself quiet in it, undetectable, a presence so small it didn't register. These were not minor capabilities. In combination with everything else she had been taught, they made her something that had very few equivalents in the galaxy. But there was an absence in this education, something not given. The Force, as the Jedi understood it, had a quality of openness, a receptivity, a willingness to receive from the Force rather than only directing it. A relationship with something larger than individual will and individual purpose. None of this was part of what she was taught. What she received was control, total, absolute, relentless control. The Force as a river, she had learned to dam and channel and redirect, but never simply to enter and be carried by. She would not understand the weight of that absence for years. She did not, at the time, have any framework that would have let her name it as a loss. And beneath all of it, beneath the languages, the combat, the Force, the cover identities, the accumulated operational competence, was something done to the interior of her that was harder to see than any of these, and far harder to undo. Through years of patient and deliberate instruction, through the specific and intimate pressure of training, conducted by a man who understood the Force well enough to shape the psychological structures of those near him, she was brought to understand something that functioned less like a learned belief and more like the floor beneath her feet. Her will and the Emperor's will were not aligned. They were continuous. To want what he wanted wasn't submission. It wasn't the suppression of her own desires in deference to someone else's. It was, as she understood it then, the highest form of selfhood available to her. The clearest, most purposeful expression of who she actually was. Outside of his service, she was not a smaller version of herself. She simply didn't exist. It would take her years, some of the most painful years of a life not short on pain, to fully understand what had been taken from her in the building of that belief. At the time, she experienced it not as a cage, but as clarity, as the absence of the particular confusion she would later observe in other people. People who seemed to exhaust themselves daily with the unanswerable question of what they wanted, who they were, what their lives were supposed to add up to. She had none of that confusion. She knew exactly what she was and exactly what she was for. The price of that clarity was everything underneath it. And yet, and this is the detail that matters most in the long arc of her story, the conditioning was never complete. Something at her core remained, quietly and persistently, her own. She had been trained not to attach, not to linger, not to carry anything personal from one assignment to the next. But she found people interesting. She paid attention to them in ways that no mission required. Even in her most operational years, some part of her remained genuinely, irreducibly curious about the lives of the people she moved among. It is a small thing. Described plainly, it doesn't sound like the foundation of anything, but it was the thread the conditioning had never managed to cut. The one that, when everything else collapsed, she would be able to follow back to herself. The Emperor built her into the finest instrument he had ever produced. What he never accounted for, what, in his certainty, he had never considered worth accounting for, was that instruments, given enough time and enough pressure, sometimes decide to become something else entirely. She didn't know that yet. The galaxy didn't know that yet. But the thread was there. It had always been there. And eventually, slowly, painfully, on a timeline no one had planned for, it would hold. The thread was there. It had always been there. But threads don't save you on their own. First, they just pull. Quietly, persistently, in the background of a life that has no space for quiet and persistent things. She had work to do, so she did it. Memory, for someone trained the way she was never really the problem. She forgot almost nothing. Faces, floor plans, the exact wording of a conversation held 3 years ago, in a dim corridor on a station she'd never officially visited. All of it catalogued, stored, retrievable on demand. The problem was what she was supposed to do with certain memories once she had them. The training had given her a system. What mattered? Tactical adjustments, lessons learned, the specific shape of a mistake that must not be repeated. What did not matter? The faces, the names, the particular quality of light in a room when something irreversible happened. These were to be filed away behind doors she did not routinely open. Stored, yes. Visited, no. For most of her active years, the system worked. She moved, she completed, she moved again. The galaxy was large and the assignments were many, and there was always a next thing waiting. But systems built by other people for other purposes have a way of developing cracks. And cracks, ignored long enough, become something else entirely. Svivrin was 11 months. She arrived as a mid-level administrative aide attached to a regional governor's office, carrying a complete identity she had built over 3 weeks. Work history, personal history, the small habitual details that make a person feel real to the people around them. She was good at this, genuinely good, in ways that went beyond technical proficiency. People liked her. They trusted her in the specific, unexamined way that people trust someone they find easy to be around. She paid attention to them. She remembered what they told her. She asked questions that showed she had been listening, and they responded to that with a warmth they couldn't have explained and didn't try to. By the end of 4 months, she knew the office better than most people who had worked there for years. By the end of 8, she had identified 3 officials who were quietly coordinating with rebel sympathizers in the outer districts. By the end of 11, she had filed her report, closed the identity, and left Svivrin on an early morning transport without saying goodbye to anyone. She didn't think about the people she left behind. That was the rule. That was the system. She followed it. Sivris was different in texture, but identical in structure. a smuggling network. Medical supplies moving through unregistered channels to besieged rebel cells operating in the mid-rim. She spent 6 weeks mapping the operation, its routes, its contacts, its funding, the specific individuals who kept it running. Then she dismantled it. She was efficient. She was thorough. She left nothing behind that could be traced, and nothing incomplete that could grow back. On the transport out of Sivris, she sat near a viewport and watched the planet fall away beneath her, and she felt the particular blankness that always followed a completed assignment. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not relief. Just the clean, functional absence of a problem that had existed and now didn't. She was 23 years old. She had been doing this for years. It felt, at the time, like a completely normal way to be alive. Corellia, she doesn't talk about. Not then. Not in any of the accounts that survive from later in her life. It appears in the fragmentary records of that period only as a notation, an operational success, a problem resolved, a mission completed within parameters. Whatever happened in those 3 weeks, she filed it and closed the door, and never, as far as anyone has been able to determine, opened it again. There are things you choose not to carry. She was very good at choosing. She had been taught by the best. But Kessel is different. Kessel is the one she couldn't file. She was there on a support operation. Intelligence gathering attached to a broader imperial sweep through a sector suspected of harboring rebel contacts. Not her primary mission. A secondary assignment, a matter of days, the kind of work she could complete in her sleep. The sweep itself was conducted by a stormtrooper unit operating on orders that had been issued far above her level. She was not responsible for the decisions made that day. She had not issued those orders and would not have issued them. She was present, and that was the extent of her connection to what happened. There was a family caught in the wrong place. There was a child. She saw the child's face for approximately 4 seconds, maybe less, in the middle of an operation, in a moment of movement and noise, and the kind of controlled chaos that military sweeps always produce. 4 seconds, a face, and then it was over, and she was moving again. She completed the assignment. She filed her report. She received the next set of orders and departed Kessel on the next available transport. But the face was still there. Behind the door, where she put it, yes. Filed away in the place where things that did not matter operationally were stored. But it hadn't stayed flat the way those memories were supposed to. It had weight. An unusual, specific, inconvenient weight that she noticed every time something brushed against the door. She didn't examine this. She didn't have a framework for examining it that wouldn't have immediately converted it into an operational lesson. Be more careful, maintain more distance. You don't place yourself in proximity to situations outside your direct operational scope. She applied the lesson. She moved on, but the weight remained. It did not reduce with time the way it was supposed to. This is the part of her story that the records can't fully capture. Not because the records are missing, but because what was happening wasn't operational. It wasn't tactical. It had no mission designation, and no completion date, and no metric by which success or failure could be measured. She was accumulating something, assignment by assignment, year by year, in the small gaps between the work and the next work. A ledger she hadn't opened and hadn't asked for, filling up with entries she couldn't categorize and couldn't close. It wasn't guilt exactly. Guilt requires a framework of right and wrong that she had not been given in any form she could apply to her own actions. It wasn't doubt, because doubt requires the existence of an alternative, a different course of action you could have taken, a different version of yourself that might have chosen otherwise. She had no alternative. She had always known exactly what she was. It was something with no name in the vocabulary she had been given, something that pressed against the inside of the architecture without quite finding a crack large enough to get through. She kept moving. The assignments continued. The galaxy continued to move around her in its enormous and indifferent patterns. There was a posting in the outer rim that lasted almost a year, a cover so deep she barely surfaced between the beginning and the end of it. A manufacturing consortium, labor disputes being quietly leveraged by rebel organizers, a situation that required sustained presence and the kind of patient social intelligence that she had always found easier than she was supposed to find it. She lived inside that cover the way she always did, completely. She had colleagues in that posting who thought of her as a friend. She ate meals with them. She heard about their families, their worries, the small, ordinary textures of their lives that had nothing to do with any imperial interest, and everything to do with the fact that they were people, and she was, functionally, one of them for the duration. When it ended, she left, clean, complete, no trace. On the transport out, somewhere over the outer rim, dark, she sat with her hands in her lap and thought about nothing in particular. She was very practiced at thinking about nothing in particular when the assignment was over. But there was a woman from that posting whose name she still remembered years later. A woman who had once told her, over a meal, neither of them would remember as significant, that she hoped things would get easier. She hadn't said it to Mara specifically. She'd said it to the person she thought Mara was, to the cover, to the fiction, and it had landed anyway, sideways, in the place where the things she wasn't supposed to carry were kept. The Emperor's voice was there through all of it, not constant, not intrusive in the way that might have broken a less disciplined mind, but present in the background, the way a low frequency is present, something you feel in the chest rather than hear with the ears. It oriented her, see, it reminded her of her purpose. On the nights when the ledger pressed a little harder than usual, when the weight of a filed-away memory made the architecture feel less solid than it was supposed to feel, his presence in the Force was the thing that made the floor hold. She was his hand. She had a function. She was not the sum of the faces she had seen, and the names she had not let herself learn, and the child on Kessel whose weight she still carried despite every instruction to set it down. She was a purpose, and purpose, she had been taught, was the only thing that mattered. For years, she believed it. For years, it was enough. Then the voice went silent, not faded, not distant. It stopped the way a light stops when someone cuts the power. Total, immediate, and absolute. She was not at Endor when it happened. She was somewhere else entirely, on an assignment whose details are among the most carefully guarded gaps in her biography, in the middle of a mission that suddenly had no commander, no context, no structure supporting it from above. The silence lasted for 1 second, then 5, then an hour, then longer. And in the space of that silence, with the Force where it had always been, but the presence that had always filled it simply and completely gone, she understood. The Emperor was dead. The framework was gone. And she was still, somehow, alive in the galaxy, with a ledger full of things she'd never been allowed to name, a lifetime of assignments nobody remembered, and exactly one thing left in the architecture that still had any shape at all: kill Luke Skywalker. The silence didn't arrive gently. It arrived the way a wall does when you walk into it in the dark. Sudden, total, and disorienting, in a way that takes a moment to even understand as disorientation. 1 second, the presence was there. The next second, it wasn't. And the galaxy, enormous and indifferent as always, kept moving as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed. To understand what that silence meant to her, you have to understand what the presence had been. Not a voice in the conventional sense, not words delivered through any external channel. It was more fundamental than that, a quality in the force itself, a specific weight that had been part of the background of her awareness for as long as she could remember. The way you feel a building's temperature before you consciously register it. The way you know someone is standing behind you before you turn around. It had been there her entire life, orienting, constant, the fixed point around which everything else in her existence was organized. And then, above a forest moon, she wasn't even near. It stopped. She knew immediately. She didn't need a transmission. She didn't need a report filtering through Imperial intelligence channels or a news broadcast from a rebel source. She felt the place in the Force where his presence had been, and it was empty in a way that had only one explanation. The Emperor was dead. She held that knowledge for a long moment, not in shock exactly, because shock implies a system overwhelmed, and her systems were trained to absorb impact without shutting down. It was something quieter than shock, the specific stillness of someone standing in a room where the furniture has been removed, trying to remember where to put their feet. The mission she had been on, its details still unclear in every surviving account, deliberately so, was suddenly without context. The operational framework that had supported it was gone. The authority that had sanctioned it was gone. The man who had known what she was doing and why, the only person in the galaxy who had ever known the full shape of her purpose, was simply and completely gone. She completed what she could complete. Then she stopped. And for the first time in her adult life, there was nothing waiting on the other side of completion. Nothing except the last thing he had ever sent her. It had arrived before the battle was over. That specific detail matters more than it might seem. The Emperor transmitted it while the engagement above Endor was still unfolding, while the rebel fleet was fighting through Imperial defenses toward the Death Star, while the outcome was still, in the purely military sense, uncertain. He sent it not as a contingency plan, not as a precaution against a defeat he was acknowledging might happen. He sent it the way he sent everything, with total certainty, with the conviction of a man who had already seen the shape of the moment and was acting on what he saw. What he saw in those final hours was a young man from Tatooine standing at the center of everything. Someone who had moved through every layer of Imperial power and survived. Someone who had faced Darth Vader twice and not broken. Someone who had, by the sheer improbable fact of his existence and his choices, become the single greatest threat to everything Palpatine had spent decades constructing. The Emperor was many things. Patient, calculating, capable of a strategic vision that operated across timescales most minds couldn't hold. But in those final hours, facing the one variable he had underestimated, he was also something else. He was furious, and he aimed that fury with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime learning to use people as instruments, directly at her. Kill Luke Skywalker. 5 words. Delivered not through any communication channel, but through the Force itself, pressed into her awareness with an intensity that went beyond instruction. It carried his emotional state with it. His cold, specific, focused rage at a boy who had refused to be what the galaxy's most powerful man had decided he should be. That rage landed in her and didn't leave. This is the part that requires the most care to describe accurately, because the easy version of this story makes it simple. The Emperor planted a compulsion, she carried it, end of explanation. But the reality was more complicated. And, in its way, more troubling than that, the rage became hers. Not instantly, not through any single moment of transfer, but gradually, through the weeks and months that followed Endor, as she metabolized it into her own emotional architecture. His fury at Skywalker merged with her grief at the loss of the only framework she had ever known, and what emerged from that combination felt, from the inside, entirely personal, entirely her own. She hated Luke Skywalker with a precision and a depth that surprised even her on the occasions she examined it honestly. Not the clean, operational contempt she had developed for enemies across years of service. Something messier, more specifically targeted. A hatred that had a face and a name, and a texture unlike anything she had felt before. She told herself, for a while, that it was rational, that Skywalker was the single individual most responsible for the collapse of the order she had served, that his removal would be a legitimate strategic contribution to the ongoing Imperial resistance effort, that the last command was not an emotional response to grief, but a sound tactical objective that she had both the capability and the obligation to pursue. She was not being honest with herself. She knew it, somewhere beneath the tactical framing. She just wasn't ready yet to look at what was underneath. The galaxy that existed on the other side of Endor was a different place from the one she had operated in. Not immediately, not overnight. The Empire didn't collapse like a building demolished from below. It fractured. It fragmented into competing power structures, regional moffs asserting territorial control, naval commanders making independent decisions about how to respond to the new political reality, Imperial intelligence dividing along lines of loyalty and self-interest that the organization had always contained but never had to act on before. For someone with her skills, this environment was survivable. She had identities. She had resources, credits stored in ways designed to outlast any single government's collapse, contacts in criminal networks that operated entirely outside the political structures now in chaos. She found work. Not Imperial work, not anymore. There was no centralized Imperial authority left to work for. But the galaxy's underworld had needs that did not change with the political weather, and she had capabilities that met those needs precisely. She survived. She was very good at surviving. But survival and stability are not the same thing, and beneath the functional surface of her post-Endor life, she was not stable. The framework that had organized her entire identity was gone, and what had replaced it was not a new framework. It was a single fixed point in an otherwise open landscape. One objective, one remaining thread of purpose, one thing left in the architecture with any defined shape. She tracked Skywalker from a distance, not obsessively, not with a fully developed operational plan, more as a background project, something her mind returned to in the quiet spaces between work. She learned what she could about the New Republic's formation, about the battles being fought across a dozen fronts as Imperial remnants attempted to hold territory, about Skywalker's growing centrality to the Rebel Alliance's military and symbolic power. She told herself she was gathering intelligence. She told herself she was preparing. She told herself the command was still valid, still operationally sound, still worth pursuing when the right moment and the right circumstances aligned. What she was actually doing was holding on to the last thing the Emperor had given her, because letting go of it meant standing fully in the open space of her own life, without a single landmark left to navigate by. There were nights, on whatever ship or station or temporary accommodation she currently occupied, when she sat with the silence and tried to locate herself inside it. Who was she without the mission? Who was she without the voice in the background, without the presence in the Force that had always told her where she was relative to everything else? The honest answer in those early years was that she didn't know. She had been given a complete identity, skills, purpose, capability, clarity of function. She had not been given a self. And the difference between those two things, which she had never had cause to examine before, was becoming the central fact of her existence. The rage helped, in the way that having something to push against always helps when you're not sure what you're standing on. The command helped. The fixed point of Skywalker's name, in the landscape of her purpose, gave her something to organize the days around, even on the days when acting on it was nowhere near operationally possible. It was not a healthy way to live. She would, years later, be able to say that clearly. But health is a concept that requires a baseline, and she had never had one. She was doing the only thing she knew how to do. She was surviving. She was moving. She was carrying the last command forward through a galaxy that had no place for her yet. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, operating from the outside of the New Republic's structures with the information available to her at that time, was that the man she had been ordered to kill was not the person the Emperor's fury had described him as. She had inherited a portrait, rendered in rage, just painted with the specific distortions of a dying man's final assessment of the person who had undone him. The portrait showed a threat, a symbol, an enemy. It did not show a person. That distinction would eventually matter more than anything else in her story. But not yet. Not for years yet. There were things that had to happen first, and a path she had to travel that would take her far from the straight line between the last command and its intended conclusion. The galaxy was moving. She was moving with it in the complicated dark of her own becoming, carrying a dead man's fury and her own unnamed grief, and the quiet, persistent thread of the person she had always been underneath all of it. She was not done, not even close to done, but she did not know yet what she was becoming. The underworld doesn't ask where you came from. That's its first and most useful quality. It doesn't require background checks or loyalty oaths, or the kind of institutional paperwork that leaves traces in systems someone might later search. It requires competence, reliability, and the good sense not to create problems for the people paying you. Everything else is negotiable. She had competence in abundance. She had reliability built into her at a level most people in that world couldn't match if they tried. And she had spent her entire career understanding, at a very precise level, exactly what kinds of problems were worth creating and what kinds weren't. She fit. That was the uncomfortable truth of those years. She fit into the underworld the way a key fits a lock, not because it was built for that purpose, but because the shape was right. Talon Carter ran information. He ran cargo as well, smuggled goods, contraband of various categories. The kind of physical merchandise that moved through the galaxy's unregulated lanes, regardless of who was currently enforcing trade restrictions. But his real currency was knowledge. He knew things about the state of the post-Endor galaxy that most intelligence organizations would have paid serious resources to acquire, and he sold that knowledge with a consistency and a reliability that gave his organization something rare in its sector of the economy. A reputation. Not for ethics, exactly, for accuracy, for following through, for being within the specific moral framework of a business that operated entirely outside legal structures, a man whose word meant something. She found her way into his network through the kind of indirect path that characterizes most significant professional relationships in the underworld. A contact who knew a contact, a job completed well enough that the recommendation moved upward, a face-to-face assessment with Card himself that lasted less than an hour and resulted in an offer she accepted without visible hesitation. She was not using her real name. She hadn't used it with any regularity since Endor. The name Mara Jade was kept close, deployed only when she needed to invoke it for specific purposes, and presented to the world under a rotating series of identities she maintained with the ease of someone for whom cover was not a performance but a second skin. What she brought to the Carter organization was significant. Combat capability of a level that exceeded anything his existing security personnel could offer. Languages, a working knowledge of Imperial systems and protocols that remained operationally valuable even as the Empire fragmented, and a quality of social intelligence, the ability to read people, to move through complicated social environments without friction. That Carter, himself a man of considerable perceptive ability, recognized immediately as something outside the ordinary range. He hired her. He watched her carefully afterward, the way careful people watch useful things they don't entirely understand. She performed, consistently and without obvious effort, exactly as well as she appeared capable of performing. The work was good. That was the honest assessment, and it made the situation harder, not easier, because good work had always been the thing that steadied her. In the Imperial years, the quality of the work had been the constant, the one thing she could rely on when everything else was variable. She was good at this, and being good at something had always provided a kind of internal coherence that nothing else quite matched. The Carter organization moved information across the galaxy with the efficiency of a well-run logistics network. She was part of that movement. She ran contacts, verified intelligence, assessed the reliability of sources, occasionally handled situations where information transfer became complicated by the kind of human factors that required more than analytical skill to resolve. She was valuable. She was trusted within the specific and carefully bounded trust that Carter extended to people he considered assets. She built a life inside it, small, contained, defined by the dimensions of what was operationally required, quarters on whatever ship she was currently assigned to. A reputation in Carter's network that had nothing to do with her actual history, and everything to do with what people observed her doing in the present. Colleagues who respected her capability and kept a certain cautious distance from her personally, the kind of distance that forms naturally around people who are excellent at their work and completely opaque about everything else. She ate meals with these people. She sat in briefings with them. She moved through the rhythm of organizational life with the same fluent social ease she had always brought to cover identities. Except that this was not, technically, a cover. This was just her life now. This was just what her days looked like. The distinction was harder to locate than it should have been. The galaxy was rebuilding around her. That was the backdrop to all of it. The enormous, complicated, sometimes violent process of a political order, reassembling itself after the collapse of something that had held everything in place for 2 decades. The new republic was forming, expanding, negotiating with systems that had lived under imperial rule and were now making decisions about what came next. The imperial remnants were fragmenting into competing factions, as some fighting to hold territory, some negotiating terms, some simply waiting to see how the landscape settled before committing to a direction. It was the kind of historical moment that people who were inside it rarely recognized as such. Too much noise. Too many immediate problems demanding immediate attention. The shape of what was happening only becomes visible later, from a distance, when the dust has settled enough to see the outline. She saw it. That was one of the things her training had given her that she hadn't been able to set down even when she wanted to. the ability to read large-scale political movement the way most people read a room. She understood what the New Republic was building, what the Imperial resistance was losing, what the underworld's position in the New Order was likely to become as institutional power gradually reasserted itself over ungoverned space. She understood it the way you understand a view through a window. Clear, detailed, entirely accurate, and completely separate from the room you're standing in. She was outside it. That was the thing she couldn't resolve, the thing that pressed against the inside of her days, with a quiet persistence she had no technical solution for. The galaxy was becoming something new, and she was watching it become that thing from a position of total professional competence and total personal disconnection. She wasn't building anything. She was maintaining a position, surviving skillfully, adapting efficiently, performing excellently, and going nowhere that she had chosen toward nothing that was hers. The rage was still there. It had changed in texture over the years since Endor, less sharp, less immediate, but no less present. It had settled from something acute into something chronic, less a flame, more a low and persistent heat in the background of everything. She still tracked Skywalker when the work gave her access to relevant intelligence. She still held the last command somewhere in the architecture of her purpose, not quite in the active files and not quite in the closed ones either. It sat in a middle space she had never quite organized, waiting for a moment she hadn't yet been able to identify as the right one. She told herself she was still waiting for operational conditions to align. She told herself it was patience, the same patience that had always been one of her professional strengths. She told herself a lot of things in those years that were accurate in their surface detail and not entirely honest in their underlying structure. The truth was simpler and harder. The command was the last thing that connected her to the person she had been. Completing it would mean finishing that chapter entirely. And as much as she understood intellectually that the chapter needed to be finished, as much as she could see clearly that carrying a dead emperor's final instruction was not a foundation anyone could build a life on, she was not ready. She was not, in whatever specific and unnameable way, ready to stand in the completely open space that would exist on the other side of letting it go. So she carried it, and she worked, and the years moved. Carter noticed things. That was his particular gift, observation without intrusion, the ability to see the shape of a person's interior life from the evidence of their exterior behavior without making the observation visible. He noticed that she was excellent at her work and completely unanchored beneath it. He noticed the specific quality of her attention when certain kinds of intelligence crossed her desk. Anything involving the New Republic's military structure, anything involving Skywalker's movements or the status of what was slowly becoming a new Jedi presence in the galaxy. He noticed that she carried something she had never discussed with him, or as far as he could tell, with anyone. He didn't press. That was also his gift, knowing when to press and when to simply watch. She was too valuable and too functional and too clearly in possession of her own timing for pressing to accomplish anything except the loss of someone he'd found very difficult to replace. He watched. She worked. The organization moved through the galaxy's complicated new landscape, and she moved with it, and the window between her and the world that was rebuilding itself outside stayed exactly where it was, until the day Grand Admiral Thrawn returned, until the day the Imperial remnants found the thing they'd been missing since Endor, a commander capable of turning fragmentation back into coherence, until the day the political landscape shifted in ways that made her particular combination of capabilities suddenly, urgently relevant to people she had spent years carefully not being relevant to. The orbit was about to change. She didn't know it yet, but the galaxy, indifferent as always to individual timelines, was already in motion. She had built a portrait of him over years, assembled it piece by piece from intelligence reports, New Republic dispatches, intercepted communications, the kind of second-hand information that accumulates around a person who has become symbolically important to an entire political movement. She knew his operational history. She knew his role at Yavin, at Hoth, above Endor. She knew the broad outlines of what he was becoming, a Jedi, or something in the direction of one, the last practitioner of a tradition the Emperor had spent decades systematically erasing. She knew all of this, and none of it was him. That was the first thing she registered when the actual encounter became unavoidable. The portrait and the person were not the same thing. They never are in her experience, but the gap between what she had constructed in her mind and what she encountered in reality was wider than she had anticipated, and it landed with a quiet force she hadn't prepared for. Grand Admiral Thrawn's campaign changed the geometry of everything. That's the only accurate way to describe what his return meant for the fragile, still-forming structure of the post-Endor galaxy. He arrived not with the blunt, overwhelming force that had characterized most Imperial military doctrine, but with something more precise and, in its way, more dangerous. A strategic intelligence that operated several moves ahead of every response the New Republic could mount. A methodical campaign of pressure, applied at exactly the right points to produce maximum disruption with minimum resource expenditure. He was brilliant. Even people who spent that period fighting against him have generally said so in the years since. Thrawn was, by any honest assessment, the most capable military commander the Empire produced in its entire history, and his return gave the Imperial remnants something they had been missing since the Emperor's death: coherence, direction, the sense that the fragmented pieces of a broken order were being assembled by someone who knew what he was doing, back into something that could function. For the New Republic, this was a crisis of a specific and serious kind. For Carter's organization, operating as it did in the contested space between political factions, it was a problem of immediate and practical urgency. And for her, it was the thing that collapsed the distance she had maintained between herself and the one name she had been carrying for years. Thrawn's people found Card first. That was the sequence of events that set everything in motion. The Imperial forces, moving with the kind of precise intelligence that characterized everything Thrawn did, located Carter's base of operations and moved on it before he had time to fully execute an evacuation. The organization scattered. Personnel went in different directions through emergency protocols that had been prepared for exactly this kind of contingency, but had never before been activated at this scale. She escaped. Carter did not. Gia and the only people in the galaxy with both the motivation and the operational capacity to extract him from Imperial custody were the ones she had spent 5 years carefully not being relevant to. The specifics of how she ended up working alongside Luke Skywalker are, in the surviving accounts, both well documented and somehow still surprising every time you trace them. Not because the tactical logic was unclear. It was entirely clear, the kind of forced cooperation that hostile circumstances produce regularly in lives lived at the edges of large political conflicts. But because of what she brought to that cooperation from the inside, and what she discovered in the process of it, she had a mission objective when she approached the New Republic for help: extract Card. That was the function. Everything else the cooperation, the proximity to people she had operated against, the necessary temporary alignment with a political structure she had spent her career working against, was instrumental, means to an end. She was very clear about this, at least in the version she presented to everyone around her, including herself. Skywalker was part of the package. He was involved in the operation that followed in the way that central figures tend to be involved in things during periods of active crisis. Not always by formal assignment. Sometimes simply because circumstances kept producing situations where his particular combination of capabilities was relevant. She encountered him, worked alongside him, had to coordinate with him in real time, under conditions that did not allow for the careful management of distance she had always preferred. He was not what the portrait had shown her. That was the central fact of the encounter, the one she kept returning to in the intervals between operational demands. The portrait had shown her a symbol, a threat, a figure of significance whose meaning was organized entirely around what he represented to the people who opposed the Empire. What she encountered was a person, specific, particular, present in the way that real people are present, with habits and reactions and a quality of attention that had nothing to do with symbolic significance and everything to do with the individual actually standing in front of her. He was kind. That was the detail that landed hardest and made the least operational sense. Not kind in a performed way, not kind as a social strategy, genuinely, straightforwardly kind, in a manner so unconditional, it registered to her trained awareness almost as a provocation. She had spent her career learning to read kindness as a tactic, as a surface presentation designed to produce a specific response. Authentic, unconditional kindness was not something her system had a clean category for. She was not gentle with him. She was not warm, not cooperative beyond the operational minimum, not inclined to make the interaction easier than it had to be. She carried the years of rage and the last command and the portrait openly enough that he couldn't have missed the hostility even if he'd been trying to. And he responded to all of it, the sharpness, the barely concealed contempt, the specific quality of her attention that should have communicated very clearly that she was not someone who wished him well, with a patience that was neither passive nor naive. He saw her. That was the most unsettling thing. Not all of her, not the full history, not the specific weight of what she was carrying in her direction. But he saw enough. He registered her in the force and in the ordinary perceptive way of someone paying genuine attention, as a person rather than a function. He extended toward her, without apparent calculation, the same basic quality of regard he seemed to extend toward everyone around him. She found this deeply irritating. She found it, underneath the irritation, something else, something she had no clean language for and would not examine directly for some time yet. There was a moment, somewhere in the operational middle of the Carter extraction, when she had him. Not figuratively, literally. A moment when circumstances and positioning and the proximity that sustained cooperation produces aligned in a way that would have made completing the last command not just possible, but straightforward. She registered it the way she registered all tactical opportunities, automatically, precisely, with the trained awareness of someone whose threat assessment runs continuously in the background of every situation. She didn't move. The moment passed. The operation continued. She told herself, in the immediate aftermath, that it had been a tactical calculation, that completing the objective in those circumstances would have compromised the extraction, would have created problems she didn't need, would have been operationally inefficient in ways that outweighed the value of the outcome. All of this was true. None of it was the reason. The reason was something she didn't examine directly for weeks afterward, and then only partially, and then only because not examining it was beginning to cost her the quality of sleep she needed to function at the level she required of herself. The reason was that in the moment when she had him, she had also, for the first time, against every structure of her training and every year of accumulated rage, registered him as a person she did not want to kill, not someone she liked, not someone she had forgiven, not someone whose survival she had decided to prioritize over the completion of the command. Something more specific and more troubling than any of those things. She had looked at him through the Force and found, instead of the target she had been carrying for 5 years, an actual human being, particular and present and entirely unaware in that moment of how close he was to the end of his story. She put the moment away. She filed it in the place where things she wasn't ready to look at directly were kept. She completed the operation, extracted Carter, returned to the work of her own survival with the efficiency that had always been one of her most reliable qualities. But the filing didn't hold the way it used to. The moment had weight, a specific, inconvenient, undeniable weight that pressed against the door she'd put it behind with a persistence that the other filed things. The child on Kessel, the woman from the Outer Rim posting, and the accumulated ledger of her service years had never quite managed. The Carter operation ended. The immediate crisis passed. Thrawn's campaign continued in the background of the galaxy's political life, building toward a confrontation that would eventually resolve in ways no one had fully anticipated. She returned to the organization's work, to the daily rhythm of information and logistics, and the operational routine that had structured her post-Endor years. But something had shifted. She could feel it in the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. Not a dramatic rupture, not a sudden reorientation, but a tilt. A degree or two of movement in the underlying structure that changes over time, the direction you end up walking. The portrait of Skywalker was gone. She couldn't reconstruct it. Every time she tried to reassemble the target, the symbol, the threat, the fixed point of her remaining purpose, the face of the actual person she had stood next to in a corridor on a ship during a complicated extraction operation appeared instead. Real, specific, present, impossible to convert back into the abstract enemy she needed him to be in order for the last command to remain what it had always been. She didn't know at this point what to do with any of this. She was not someone who had ever had practice in the art of not knowing what to do. Her entire life had been organized around certainty, the certainty of mission, of purpose, of a framework that told her what things were and what they meant and what she was supposed to do about them. The absence of that certainty was not, for her, the relief it might have been for someone who had been uncertain before. It was the most disorienting thing she had ever experienced. More disorienting than Endor, more destabilizing than the silence. Because this was not something that had been taken from her from the outside. This was something shifting from within. Something she was doing, or not doing, or becoming, without a name for it yet and without a map. The thread was pulling again, the one the conditioning had never managed to cut, the one that led, if she ever chose to follow it all the way, back to herself. She wasn't ready to follow it all the way, not yet. But she had stopped, for the first time, actively resisting it. While she was sorting through the wreckage of a 5-year-old command and the unsettling reality of a man who refused to be her enemy, the galaxy was doing what it always does, moving, shifting, reorganizing itself around new pressures without waiting for any individual to finish processing the last set of changes. Grand Admiral Thrawn had been out there for months already, building, calculating, moving pieces across a board that most of the New Republic's military leadership hadn't yet recognized as a board. By the time his campaign became visible enough to generate the kind of alarm it deserved, he was already several moves ahead of the alarm. That gap between when the threat became real and when it became understood was, in many ways, the most Thrawn thing about the entire campaign. To understand what Thrawn represented, you have to set aside the conventional template for imperial military power. The Empire, at its height, had operated largely through overwhelming force, massive fleets, superior firepower, the implicit and sometimes explicit threat of consequences so disproportionate that resistance became a calculation no rational actor could justify. It was not subtle doctrine. It was not designed to be. When you have the largest military apparatus in the known galaxy, subtlety is a luxury you don't particularly need. Thrawn didn't think that way. He had never thought that way, which was part of why he had been, during the height of the Empire, simultaneously one of its most valuable assets and one of its most uncomfortable presences. He won differently than Imperial commanders were supposed to win. He studied his enemies, not just their military dispositions, their fleet compositions, their tactical preferences, but their art, their culture, the aesthetic and philosophical frameworks through which they understood the world and made decisions within it. He believed and demonstrated repeatedly that you could read a civilization's approach to conflict in its creative output, that what a people made told you, if you looked carefully enough, how they would fight. It was an unusual theory. It was also, in his hands, devastatingly effective. When he returned from the unknown regions with his Star Destroyer and his agenda and his particular quality of cold, comprehensive strategic vision, the Imperial remnants that had been fragmenting since Endor suddenly had something to cohere around. Not just a commander, a direction. A sense that the loss at Endor was not a permanent conclusion, but a setback that could be reversed by someone patient and intelligent enough to approach the reversal correctly. He gave them back their confidence. That was, in some ways, the most dangerous thing he did. The New Republic, in this same period, was doing the difficult and unglamorous work of becoming a government. This is harder than it sounds. Defeating an empire is one kind of problem. Large, violent, urgent, with clear metrics for success and failure. Building a stable political order from the wreckage of the defeated empire is a completely different kind of problem, one that is slower and more complicated and less amenable to the kind of decisive action that wins battles. There were member worlds with incompatible interests. There were political factions within the Republic's own structure that disagreed, sometimes bitterly, about the right approach to everything, from military spending to the legal status of former imperial territories. There were systems that had collaborated with imperial rule and now wanted integration into the new order on terms that other systems found unacceptable. There were resource disputes and jurisdictional questions, and the endless, grinding administrative labor of constructing institutions that could actually hold a galaxy together across the distances and differences involved. And there was the military question, which was the most urgent and the least resolved. The New Republic had won at Endor on the strength of a rebel alliance that had been built for asymmetric warfare, for hitting hard and moving fast and surviving against a larger and better equipped opponent through speed and flexibility and the willingness to accept losses that a conventional force couldn't sustain. That was not the same skill set required to defend a government. Defense requires permanence. It requires the ability to hold ground, to protect civilian populations, to respond to threats across multiple theaters simultaneously, without the option of simply relocating the base of operations when the pressure becomes too intense. The alliance was becoming a military. The military was becoming an institution. And institutions, in their early years, are fragile in ways that experienced opponents know exactly how to exploit. Thrawn knew. He had been studying them for years, from whatever distance the unknown regions had provided. And when he moved, it was with the precision of someone who had already mapped the vulnerabilities and was now simply executing against the map. She watched all of this from the position she had occupied for years, between things, inside the flow of information that Carter's network processed without being formally part of any of the structures the information was about. She had access, through her work, to intelligence that most people operating at any single level of this conflict couldn't see. She could see the New Republic's anxiety and its internal fractures. She could see the Imperial remnant's renewed coherence and the specific shape of what Thrawn was building. She could see the underworld's complicated navigation of an environment where the rules were changing faster than most organizations could adapt to. She could see all of it, and she was part of none of it. The between worlds quality of her position was not new. She had occupied a version of it since Endor, outside the Imperial structure that had dissolved, outside the New Republic that had no idea she existed, operating in the ungoverned space between them. But it had felt, in the earlier years, like a temporary condition, a transitional state she was passing through on the way to something else, even when she couldn't identify what the something else was. By the time Thrawn's campaign was in full motion, it no longer felt temporary. It felt like what her life had become, and that realization, quiet, and arriving not as a dramatic moment, but as a gradual understanding that settled over several weeks, was harder to carry than she had expected it to be. She was good at her work. She was respected within the bounded terms of Carter's organization, in the specific ways that competent people earn respect in professional environments. She had built a functional existence. She had survived the collapse of everything she had been built around and constructed, through 5 years of careful and relentless adaptation, something that looked from the outside like a life. It just didn't feel like one from the inside. And she was beginning with the particular reluctance of someone who had always preferred clarity to ambiguity, to understand why. The encounter with Skywalker had done something she hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully account for. It had cracked open the question she had been most successfully avoiding. Not the question of the last command, not the question of what she owed to the Emperor's final instruction, but the deeper question underneath all of that. The one that had been pressing against the interior walls of her life since Endor, without ever quite finding a way through. Who was she building this for? The work, the survival, the careful professional existence she had constructed inside Carter's network, all of it had a quality she was now able to see of maintenance without direction. She was maintaining a position. She was not moving toward anything. She had been, for 5 years, very expertly staying alive and staying functional and staying exactly where she was. And the question of where she actually wanted to go had remained so thoroughly unexamined that she had almost managed to convince herself it wasn't a question worth asking. Skywalker was moving towards something. That had been one of the things she'd registered in the Force during the time they'd spent in operational proximity. It wasn't ambition in the conventional sense, not the pursuit of power or status, or the kind of defined objective that most people would recognize as a goal. It was something more like orientation. He was pointed towards something, moving in a direction he had chosen or was choosing, and the movement had a quality that she hadn't encountered in another person at close range in a very long time. It was, she realized slowly, the quality of someone who knew what they were building and believed it was worth building. Seen someone who had a relationship with their own future that was something other than simply the continuation of their present circumstances. She had never had that, or rather, she had had a version of it in her imperial years, but the direction had been given to her rather than chosen, and the belief had been installed rather than arrived at. The Emperor had provided both the purpose and the conviction. She had experienced them as her own, without examining whether they were. Now, with the purpose gone and the conviction hollowed out and the last command sitting in its middle space between active and closed, she was in possession of a future that was entirely open. And open, she was discovering, was not the same as free. Open, without the capacity to choose a direction and move toward it, was just another word for lost. Thrawn's campaign pressed on. The New Republic scrambled. The galaxy's complicated political weather continued to shift in ways that affected everyone who lived inside it, whether they had chosen a side or not. She continued her work. She processed intelligence. She ran contacts. She was present, reliable, excellent, and underneath all of it, she was quietly in the process of something she didn't have a word for yet. Not a decision, exactly. Not a plan. Something earlier than both of those things. A recognition, arriving slowly and without drama, that the life she had built was not the life she was going to be able to stay in. The Force had been different since the encounter with Skywalker, subtly different in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible for someone with her sensitivity to ignore. She had spent her career maintaining total control of her Force presence, keeping it contained, directed, a tool she used outward, rather than something she allowed to move in any direction she hadn't pre-authorized. But something had shifted in the architecture of that control, a loosening that she hadn't initiated and hadn't been able to fully reverse. She was receiving more than she was used to receiving. Not overwhelming, not disruptive, just more. The ambient emotional texture of the people around her came through with slightly more resolution than it had before. Her own interior states, which she had always been able to suppress to the level of background noise, were occasionally louder than that, surfacing at moments she hadn't chosen. She didn't examine this directly. She noted it. She filed it in the category of things she was aware of, without being prepared to fully address. She had gotten very good over the course of her life at that particular category. But the Force, like the thread before it, was not interested in waiting for her to be ready. There was a briefing somewhere in the middle of the Thrawn crisis, where she sat in a room full of Card's senior people and laid out the strategic picture as she read it. The Imperial Force's disposition, the New Republic's likely response timeline, the probable pressure points Thrawn would target in the next phase of the campaign. She spoke for 20 minutes. She was precise, comprehensive, and correct about almost everything. Afterward, Shkada told her it was the clearest strategic assessment he'd received from anyone inside or outside his network during the entire crisis. She received this with the same even manner she received most things, said something appropriately modest, returned to her work. But she sat with it afterward in the quiet of her quarters and held a question she hadn't expected the moment to produce. If she could see this clearly, if she could read the large-scale movement of events with this level of accuracy, could understand the shape of what was happening across multiple theaters and multiple factions and the entire complicated landscape of a galaxy in political transition, then what was she doing with it? She was giving it to Carter, to an information broker who would convert it into product and sell it to whoever was buying. Her clarity, her capability, her particular and hard-won ability to see what was actually happening in the galaxy all of it flowing into an organization that was, by its own honest assessment, primarily interested in its own survival and profitability. There was nothing wrong with this, exactly. She had always known what Carter's organization was. She had chosen it with open eyes as the best available option in a difficult landscape. But there was a growing distance between what she was capable of and what she was doing with the capability. A gap that had been tolerable for years and was becoming, with each passing month, harder to stand inside without noticing it. The galaxy needed people who could see clearly. It was in the middle of a crisis that was going to determine the shape of the next era, and it needed people who could read it accurately and act on what they read. She could do both of those things. She was arguably doing neither of them, not in any way that connected to what actually mattered, not in any way that made the thing she could see into something that changed the outcome. This was not a conclusion she reached all at once. It was another of the slow accumulations that had characterized her interior life since Endor, a weight that built gradually until it became impossible to carry without acknowledging it was there. Thrawn died before the campaign reached its intended conclusion. Not in battle. The galaxy is rarely that straightforward. He was killed by his own bodyguard at a moment of apparent victory, in circumstances that still carry a quality of abruptness that surprises people encountering the history for the first time. The campaign collapsed without him, the way a structure collapses when the load-bearing element is suddenly removed. Quickly and then completely. And then there was just wreckage where the threat had been. The New Republic survived. Fragile, strained, having sustained costs it would spend years recovering from, but intact. The Imperial remnants fragmented again, back into the competing factions they had been before he arrived to give them coherence. The galaxy exhaled. Not completely, not with any sense that the danger had permanently passed. Too many people had seen how quickly things could shift to believe any particular stability was guaranteed. But there was a moment, in the immediate aftermath of Thrawn's death, where the acute pressure of the crisis eased enough for people to look up from the immediate problem and assess where they were. She looked up. She assessed where she was and what she found, examining her position with the same clarity she had applied to Thrawn's campaign, and the New Republic's vulnerabilities and every external situation she had been asked to analyze. What she found was a person standing at a junction she had been approaching for years, who had run out of reasons to keep standing still. The between worlds position wasn't a temporary state anymore. It was a choice, renewed every day by inaction, to remain outside everything that mattered. And she was, for the first time, less afraid of moving than she was of staying exactly where she was. The thread was pulling. The force was open in ways it hadn't been in years, and somewhere on the other side of the life she had been maintaining, there was something she hadn't allowed herself to want yet. She was going to have to want it. She was going to have to choose it, actively, with full knowledge of what the choosing would cost and where it would take her. She wasn't there yet, but she was closer than she had ever been. There is a particular kind of haunting that has nothing to do with grief. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with the dramatic weight of loss or the sharp clarity of pain. It simply persists. In the background of ordinary days, in the quiet between one task and the next, in the specific texture of certain silences that feel slightly more occupied than they should. She had been living with this haunting for years without fully naming it as such. It was just there, part of the atmosphere of her interior life, like a frequency too low to hear but present enough to feel in the chest over long exposure. She had learned to function around it, to organize her days so that the quiet was never long enough for it to become fully audible. Work helped. Movement helped. The constant operational demands of a life lived at the edges of large events helped more than almost anything else. But Thrawn was gone. The acute crisis had passed, and the galaxy, in the relative quiet that followed, had stopped helpfully filling every available space with urgency. The haunting got louder. The command was the most visible part of it, but it wasn't the whole of it. That was what she was beginning to understand. Slowly, reluctantly, in the way you understand things you have been successfully avoiding for a long time. The last command was a symptom, the specific, articulable symptom of something much larger and much older that she had been carrying since childhood, without ever having been given the tools to examine it. What the Emperor had left inside her was not just an instruction. It was a structure, an entire interior architecture built around his presence, his purpose, his will as the organizing principle of her existence. The command was the last visible piece of that architecture still standing. But the foundation it sat on was everywhere, in the way she processed information, in the way she read other people, in the way she made decisions, in the way she understood herself in relation to the world around her. She had been built by someone else, comprehensively, systematically, from an age too young to have offered any resistance worth the name. And the building had been so thorough, so complete, that most of it was invisible to her, not because it was hidden, but because it was the lens through which she saw everything else. You cannot examine the eye by looking through it. This was the problem, and it was. She was beginning to understand, not a problem she could solve alone. The decision to approach Skywalker was not made quickly or comfortably. It was made the way she made most decisions that cost her something, by exhausting every alternative first, examining each one with the thoroughness that had always characterized her operational planning, and arriving at the conclusion that the alternatives were not actually viable, not preference, elimination. She didn't want his help. That needs to be stated clearly, because it was true, and it mattered. It wasn't false modesty or performed reluctance. She had spent years cultivating the specific quality of self-sufficiency that her training had made both natural and necessary, and in asking for help from anyone, let alone from the man she had spent 5 years carrying a death order for, ran against every professional instinct she had developed across her entire adult life. But she was in possession of a problem that required something she couldn't generate internally. She needed someone who understood the Force in dimensions she had never been taught, someone who had been through their own version of this, the dismantling of a false framework, the excavation of a self from beneath the architecture of someone else's design. Someone who had faced Darth Vader, who had faced the Emperor himself in that throne room above Endor, and had come back from it with their interior intact. Skywalker was the only person in the galaxy who qualified. She found him. The conversation that followed was, by all surviving accounts, not easy for either of them. She was not warm about it. She was not vulnerable in any way that could be mistaken for openness. She presented the situation in the most operational terms she could manage. A problem, a specific need, the practical case for his involvement. And she did so with the contained, precise manner of someone offering a briefing rather than asking for anything personal. He said yes anyway, without conditions, without the kind of negotiated reciprocity that she had fully expected and had prepared arguments against. He simply said yes, and the uncomplicated directness of it was, characteristically, more unsettling than the alternative would have been. The work began quietly, not in the dramatic setting of formal Jedi instruction, not with the ceremonial weight that might have surrounded this kind of undertaking in the Old Order's time. In the unglamorous, practical circumstances of two people with complicated histories trying to work through something difficult in the limited time and space available to them. What Skywalker offered her was not a curriculum. He was not, at this stage of his own development, in a position to offer one. He was building a new understanding of the Jedi tradition himself, from fragments and Force impressions and the guidance of teachers who had died before fully transmitting what they knew. What he offered instead was something more immediate and, in its way, more useful. He offered her a mirror, not a therapeutic one, not the kind of reflective process that involves sitting quietly and being encouraged to articulate feelings. Something more active. He worked with her in the Force, in the direct and practical way that Force training at its best has always operated. Not explaining, but doing. Not describing, but demonstrating. Creating conditions in which she could encounter her own interior architecture from the outside for the first time. What she found, looking at herself this way, was illuminating and difficult in equal measure. The control was the first thing that became visible. The total, relentless, absolute control she had been taught to maintain over every dimension of her Force presence. She could see it clearly now, as a structure rather than a natural state. She could see the effort it required, the constant low-level tension of a system permanently braced against its own opening. She could see what it cost her, the chronic expenditure of energy in the maintenance of walls that she had never consciously chosen and had never seriously questioned. She had thought of this control as capability, as strength, as the mark of a disciplined practitioner who had mastered an unruly Force and made it precise. Seeing it from the outside, she recognized it as something closer to armor. Effective, yes. It had served her well in every operational context she had ever been in. But armor worn for too long without removal stops being protection and becomes confinement. The command was visible from this angle too. More visible than she had wanted it to be. She had kept it in the middle space, not active, not closed. And from the outside she could see exactly what that middle space was. It was a refuge. The last piece of the Emperor's structure she had been unwilling to dismantle because dismantling it would mean standing in the fully open space beyond it. And that space was the most frightening thing she had encountered in a life not short on frightening things. They worked on it together, carefully, non-linearly, in the imperfect and sometimes frustrating way that real psychological excavation operates when conducted by people who are not therapists and are dealing with damage that goes down to bedrock. There were sessions that produced clarity and sessions that produced only a more precise understanding of how deep the problem went. There were moments when she was able to look directly at things she had filed away for decades, and moments when she hit a wall and needed to stop. Skywalker was, throughout all of this, patient in a way she had not fully anticipated, even given what she already knew about him. Not passively patient, not the patience of someone waiting for her to finish, but actively, attentively patient, present with the specific quality of presence that she had registered in him from the beginning, the quality that refused to convert her into a function or a project or anything other than a person he was trying to help. She found this at various points in the process, both steadying and infuriating. The steadying part was straightforward. The infuriating part was more interesting. What angered her, she eventually identified, was not anything he was doing, but what his presence revealed about what she was missing. His ease with connection. His comfort with the kind of openness that she had been specifically trained to suppress. His apparently uncomplicated relationship with his own interior life. The willingness to feel what he felt, to register it honestly, to let it inform his understanding without being destabilized by it. She had never had that. She had been denied it before she was old enough to understand what was being taken. and watching it in close proximity, after years of operating in environments where no one around her had it either, produced a specific grief she hadn't been prepared for. Not jealousy, grief. The recognition of a loss that had happened so early it had never registered as a loss before. Because you can only mourn the absence of something you understand you were supposed to have. The command finally moved. Not all at once. There was no single dramatic moment of release. No cathartic instant when everything broke open and the weight lifted and she emerged on the other side renewed. It happened the way most real changes happen, gradually and then suddenly, and then completely. She was in the Force, working with Skywalker on the excavation of something specific from her Imperial training, when she encountered the command at a level she hadn't accessed before. Not the surface artifact, the 5 words, the instruction, but the structure beneath it, the emotional root system that the Emperor had embedded it in, the specific combination of his rage and her grief, and the architecture of her trained identity that had kept it alive and functional years after the man who planted it was gone. She stayed with it. This was the thing Skywalker had been trying to teach her. Not to move away from the difficult things in the Force, but to remain present with them long enough to see their actual shape. She stayed and she looked, and what she saw was not a command at all. Not really. Not anymore. What she saw was a tether. The last connection to the person she had been when the Emperor was alive. The person who had a function, a purpose, a clear and stable identity organized around his will. The command had never really been about Skywalker. It had been about her. It had been the last thing keeping her from having to fully inhabit the open space of her own existence without a framework someone else had built for her. She let it go. It is not possible to fully describe what that release felt like from the inside, and partly because the accounts she has given of this moment are sparse, and partly because some interior events are simply not translatable into external language. What she has said, in various forms, across various contexts in the years since, is that it was not the relief she had imagined it would be. It was not a lightening. It was not like setting down a weight you've been carrying too long. It was more like stepping out of a building you've lived in your entire life and standing outside it for the first time. Everything is the same. The street, the sky, the physical world. And you are disoriented in a way that has nothing to do with danger, and everything to do with the sudden enormous scale of the space around you. She stood in that space. Skywalker was somewhere nearby in the Force, present without intruding, Jews available without pressing. She stood in the space that was her own life, without the Emperor in it, without his command, without the architecture he had spent years constructing around her. It was immense. It was terrifying. It was, underneath both of those things, the first moment in her life that had ever fully belonged to her. The excavation didn't end there. It was not a single session, a single breakthrough, a single moment of release that resolved everything that had been built over a childhood and a career and 2 decades of living inside someone else's design for her. Real change of this depth takes time and costs effort in ways that are ongoing and uneven and frequently inconvenient. But something fundamental had shifted. The architecture was still there. The habits, the reflexes, the trained responses that had been built into her so deeply, they were woven into her physical instincts as much as her conscious mind. Those would take years to examine fully and longer to genuinely integrate into a life that was consciously chosen rather than simply performed. What had changed was her relationship to the architecture. She was no longer inside it without knowing she was inside it. She could see the walls now. She could feel the difference between the responses that came from genuine choice and the responses that came from conditioning. The difference, once visible, could not be made invisible again. And that visibility was, in whatever imperfect and ongoing way, the beginning of actual freedom. Skywalker said something to her near the end of one of their sessions that she has repeated in various forms, more than almost anything else from this period. The precise wording varies across the accounts. The substance is consistent. He told her that the hardest thing about the work she was doing was not the excavation itself. It was learning to trust that what she found underneath all of it, underneath the Emperor's design, underneath the training, underneath the years of service and the last command and the whole constructed architecture of her imperial identity, was worth trusting. That what she found underneath all of it was actually her. She didn't fully believe him yet. She wasn't sure she had the tools, at that stage, to fully believe anything that required trust in her own interior as a reliable source of truth. The Emperor had spent years teaching her that her interior, left to itself, was nothing. That her own will, due outside of his direction, had no legitimate shape. Unlearning that, genuinely, in the body and the force and the deep reflexive structure of how she moved through the world, was going to take longer than a few months of intensive work, with someone patient enough to stay present while she found her way. But she was in the process now, consciously, actively, having chosen it with the full knowledge of what the choosing would cost. She was in the process of becoming something the Emperor had never intended her to become. She was in the process of becoming herself. Choosing something for yourself after a lifetime of being directed turns out to feel nothing like what you might expect. There's no rush of liberation, no sudden lightness. What there is, mostly, is the quiet and slightly disorienting weight of responsibility. The understanding that the direction you're moving in now belongs to you completely, and that if it turns out to be wrong, there is no one else's design to blame it on. She had expected the choosing to feel like a rival. What it felt like, at first, was exposure. She came to the Jedi Praxium on Yavin 4 without ceremony, without announcement, with the specific quality of understated entry that had characterized her professional movements for her entire adult life. Present, functional, just giving nothing away in her bearing that she hadn't decided to give. The other students noticed her the way people notice someone who carries themselves as if they've already survived everything the training could possibly throw at them, which, in most of the ways that mattered, she had. She was not, by any conventional measure, a beginner, and that was the first complication. The Praxium was not what the old Jedi Order had been. Skywalker was building something new from fragments, part recovered history, part living force instinct, part the practical improvisation of someone trying to reconstruct a tradition that had been systematically destroyed before he was fully old enough to learn it. The students he was gathering were diverse in background, in age, in the nature and depth of their force sensitivity. Some were young, coming to this with the open flexibility of people who hadn't yet developed the kind of fixed interior structure that makes relearning difficult. Some were older, with histories of their own that complicated the simplicity of formal instruction. None of them had a history quite like hers. The training that the Praxium offered was built around principles she had never been taught. The Force as relationship rather than tool. The idea of surrender, not to another person's will, but to something larger. The current that runs beneath individual intention. The living force that connects rather than divides. The practice of stillness, of receptivity, of allowing the force to move through you rather than only directing it outward. She knew how to direct it outward. She was, in purely technical terms, more capable than most of the students around her in every dimension of force application that involved control and precision and the outward exercise of trained will. In a sparring context, in a threat assessment context, in any scenario that required the force to be a weapon or a shield or an instrument of specific purpose, she was not a student. She was something closer to a teacher. But in the dimensions, the Praxium was actually trying to develop openness, receptivity, the quality of presence that allows the force to inform rather than simply obey. She was not ahead of the beginners at all. In some of these dimensions, she was behind them. The beginners had no walls to dismantle. She had walls so thoroughly integrated into her force relationship that dismantling them was not a matter of learning new techniques, but of undoing old ones, which is always harder and slower and more unglamorous than building from scratch. She knew this. Understanding it didn't make it easier. It made it precise. She could see exactly what the problem was, and exactly where it lived, and exactly how far she had to go to resolve it. And precision, when applied to your own limitations, is not always a comfort. The other students approached her carefully at first. This was understandable. She gave them little to work with in the early weeks, not deliberately, not as a tactic, but because she was genuinely uncertain how to be among people in a context that wasn't operational. The covers she had maintained over her career had required social engagement, warmth, the performed intimacy of someone making others feel known and trusted. But that was performance in service of mission. This was different. This was just people in a shared space with no objective beyond the shared project of becoming whatever they were each trying to become. She didn't know, at first, how to do that. Not the being among people part. She had always been technically proficient at being among people. The not performing part. The being there as herself part, with no cover architecture supporting the interaction. No operational purpose organizing the relationship. No defined endpoint she was managing toward. There was a student, she has not named this person publicly, and the accounts preserve the anonymity, who sat next to her one evening at a communal meal and simply started talking. Not with any particular agenda, not with the careful approach of someone who had assessed her and decided to make a deliberate attempt at connection, just talking the way people talk when they're tired from a day of difficult training and need the ordinary human relief of speaking without weight. She listened. She found herself, without having planned to, responding. Not performing a response, actually responding, from whatever part of her had always been genuinely curious about people, the part the conditioning hadn't managed to reach. The conversation lasted an hour. She couldn't have told you afterward exactly what was said. What she could have told you was that when it ended and she returned to her quarters, something felt fractionally different from how it had felt in the morning. Not better, exactly. Just different, slightly more inhabited. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that doesn't appear in any record of her development at the Praxium and wouldn't register as significant in any formal account of her progress. But she held it quietly, in the days that followed, with the particular care she had learned to extend to things that were hers, genuinely, uncomplicatedly hers, without anyone else's design attached. The training advanced. She advanced with it, though not uniformly, and not in the way that straightforward natural talent usually advances, in a clean, upward line that the instructors can measure and record and assess against expectations. Her progress had a more complicated shape, just rapid in the areas where her existing capability could be redirected rather than dismantled. slow and effortful in the areas where the dismantling had to come first. She was the most technically precise student in any practical exercise involving force-enhanced combat. She was one of the least naturally at ease in exercises involving extended passive receptivity, the practice of simply sitting in the force without directing it, without managing it, without the constant low-level vigilance that had been the baseline state of her force relationship for her entire adult life. Stillness, the kind of stillness the old Jedi masters had described as the precondition for genuine force connection, was not a state she could enter without conscious effort. And conscious effort, applied to the pursuit of stillness, she produces something that looks like stillness and is actually just a different and more sophisticated form of control. Skywalker noticed. He didn't make an event of it. That was one of his consistent qualities as a teacher. The refusal to make any student's specific challenge into a performance, either of the challenge or of his awareness of it. He simply adjusted the approach, found the angles that worked for her specifically. Sometimes he worked with her one-on-one, not in the formal instructional way, but in the sideways way that seemed to be how he operated most effectively. Conversations that started somewhere else and arrived at the relevant point without announcing they were heading there. She learned to recognize this pattern in him. She found it, initially, slightly irritating, and then, gradually, something she appreciated more than almost anything else about working with him. He was not trying to fix her. He was not treating her like a problem to be solved on the way to some standard outcome. He was working with the specific shape of who she was. The whole complicated shape, the capability and the damage and the years of service and the particular combination of gifts and walls that made her unlike any other student he was ever likely to have. And helping her find the version of this practice that actually belonged to her. It was the first time in her life she had been taught that way. She didn't have language for it at first. The closest she could get, in her own private accounting, was that it felt like being seen without being assessed, observed without being evaluated against a predetermined standard. She was not being shaped towards someone else's design. She was being helped to find her own. The difference was everything. The friendships that formed in that period were not fast or easy or demonstrative in the way that certain kinds of friendship are. She was not, and would never be, someone who arrived at closeness quickly or who expressed it in ways that were readily visible from the outside. But the connections were real, built slowly through the sustained proximity and shared difficulty of people working on something genuinely hard together, and through the particular quality of attention she had always given to people even when she was supposed to be giving them nothing. She listened. This was the thing people consistently described in later years, when they talked about what it had been like to know her, that she listened with a completeness that most people never experience from another person. It wasn't a therapeutic quality, not the deliberate reflective attention of someone trained to make others feel heard. It was something more instinctive. She had always been curious about people. She had always paid attention in ways that went beyond operational necessity. Here, in a context where there was no operational necessity at all, the curiosity had nowhere to hide, and no professional framework to organize it into something other than what it was. What it was, it turned out, was one of the things about her that people found most genuinely remarkable. Not the combat capability, not the force sensitivity, not the extraordinary operational history that gradually became known, as in pieces to the people around her. The listening, the quality of attention that made you feel, in conversation with her, that whatever you were saying was the most interesting thing she had encountered in a significant amount of time. She was building relationships she had chosen, not covers, not operational assets, not the careful social infrastructure of a person managing their environment for professional purposes. Actual relationships with the weight and the history and the occasional friction and the specific kind of trust that forms between people who have seen each other at less than their best and chosen to stay anyway. It was unfamiliar. She was, for a long time, slightly uncertain what to do with it, but she didn't back away from it. That was the measure of how far she had come from the person who had arrived at the Praxium, with walls integrated so thoroughly into her architecture that she hadn't been able to see them. She was learning not to back away from the things that were hers, learning slowly and with effort and without any guarantee of getting it right, to inhabit her own life, rather than managing it from a controlled distance. There were hard periods within the broader process of her Jedi development. This needs to be said plainly, because the version of this story that moves too quickly from the excavation of Chapter 7 to the emergence of Chapter 8 misses something important about what genuine change actually costs. There were weeks when the progress felt entirely theoretical, when she could articulate clearly what she was working toward and feel, with equal clarity, that she was no closer to it than she had been at the beginning. There were sessions in the Force that opened things she hadn't been ready to open and left her sitting with the contents for days before she could integrate them into anything functional. There were moments of genuine doubt, not about the path. She had chosen the path with enough care that the choice itself held, even when the progress didn't feel real, but about herself, about whether the damage was too structural, too deep, too thoroughly built into the foundation of who she was to be genuinely addressed, rather than simply managed with increasing sophistication. She has spoken about this honestly. In the rare moments she has spoken about it at all, the doubt was real. It was not a temporary state that resolved cleanly once she'd worked hard enough or long enough or uncovered the right specific thing. It lived alongside the progress in the way that serious doubt always lives alongside serious work. She kept going anyway, not because the doubt went away, but because she had become, gradually, through the cumulative weight of small choices made consistently over time, someone who continued in the face of doubt rather than waiting for certainty before moving. This was new. This was genuinely, meaningfully new. The person who had arrived at the Praxium had certainty built in, had been given it, architecturally, by a man who understood that doubt is a doorway, and had closed every doorway in her before she was old enough to know what a doorway was. The person who was emerging from this process had something harder and more honest than certainty. She had commitment in the presence of uncertainty. She had the willingness to continue when she couldn't see the outcome. She had, in the most practical sense, trust in her own judgment about what was worth doing. Not because the Emperor had installed it, not because any external authority had sanctioned it, but because she had arrived at it herself through everything she had experienced and survived and chosen. The self that was emerging was not entirely new. That's the important thing to understand about what was happening to her at the Praxium, and about what genuine excavation of this kind produces. You do not find a new self underneath the conditioning. You find the actual self that was always there, the one that had been present and persistent through every year of service and every filed away memory and every quiet accumulation of the things she'd never been allowed to name, the curiosity, the attention, the thread the conditioning had never managed to cut. It was smaller than she had imagined, more ordinary, less dramatic. It didn't announce itself with any of the clarity she might have expected, given how long it had taken to reach it. It was just her, present, flawed, still in possession of walls. She was still learning to choose between maintaining and lowering, still carrying the weight of a history that wasn't going to become lighter, simply because she understood it better now. but it was hers, entirely, completely, without qualification, hers. She was a Jedi student on a moon over a gas giant, in a ragtag academy built by a man who was reconstructing a tradition from memory and instinct. She was among people she had chosen and who had chosen her in return, in the slow and ordinary way of people who have seen each other clearly and decided the seeing is worth continuing. She had a life that was going somewhere, not toward a predetermined endpoint designed by someone else, but towards something she was building, incompletely and imperfectly, and with full knowledge of the cost herself. She was, for the first time in her life, an agent of her own story. It had taken her this long to get here. She was not going to waste it. There is a moment, somewhere in the middle of their history together, that people who knew them both tend to return to when trying to explain what the relationship actually was. Not the beginning, which was too complicated to be romantic. Not the ending, which belongs to a grief too large for this chapter. Somewhere in the middle, an ordinary moment, probably. The kind that doesn't announce itself as significant while it's happening. Two people in a room, working on something difficult, disagreeing about it in the specific and comfortable way of people who have learned that the other person's disagreement is not a threat, but a resource. The argument is sharp. Neither of them is softening their position for the sake of the other's comfort. And underneath the sharpness, if you're watching carefully, there is something that looks a great deal like ease. The particular ease of two people who have decided, without ceremony and without a single defining moment they could point to, that the other person is someone they want in the room when the difficult things need working through. That is what they built. Not a fairy tale. Something more durable than that. The early period of their working relationship, after the Carder extraction through the Thrawn crisis, into the years of her Praxium training, had the texture of two people learning each other's edges without either of them fully intending to. They were in proximity more often than circumstances strictly required, partly because the galaxy kept generating situations where their particular combination of capabilities was relevant. And partly because, though neither of them would have articulated it this way at the time, they were each, in their different ways, paying attention to the other with a consistency that went beyond professional regard. She noticed things about him that she hadn't expected to notice. The specific quality of his patience, which was not passive but active. A deliberate choice, renewed regularly, to remain present with difficulty rather than managing it toward a faster resolution. The way he moved through complicated social situations, not with the calculated ease of someone performing social competence, but with the genuine comfort of someone who actually liked people and found the variety of them endlessly interesting. The fact that he was, beneath the symbolic weight the galaxy had placed on him, genuinely humble, not in the performed way of someone managing their public image, but in the real way of someone who understood how much he didn't know, and found that understanding clarifying rather than threatening. He noticed things about her too. He has spoken about this more openly than she has in the accounts that survive from later in their lives. The way she processed information, the specific quality of her attention in any situation that required real analysis, the gap between her exterior presentation and her interior life that he could feel in the Force, and that he found, from early on, more interesting than almost anything about her surface. He noticed that she was funny, in the dry and unannounced way of someone who finds the absurdity of situations genuinely amusing, but doesn't perform the amusement for an audience. He noticed that she was kind in ways she was clearly not entirely comfortable with, that the kindness emerged in unguarded moments, and she sometimes seemed faintly surprised to find it there. They did not talk about any of this directly. That was not how either of them operated, and it was, in retrospect, probably the right approach for the specific combination of histories they were each carrying. They talked about work, they talked about the Force, they argued about tactics and about the New Republic's political decisions, and about the right approach to training Force sensitives who arrived with damage already built into their architecture. These conversations were, without either of them quite meaning them to be, the real conversation. The respect came first, and it came cleanly, without the complications that followed later. This is worth noting, because respect, in their particular context, was not a simple or automatic thing. She had spent 5 years carrying a death order with his name on it. He had spent those same years as the symbol of everything her world had been built against. The gap between those starting positions and any kind of genuine mutual regard was not a small one, and it did not close quickly or without effort. What closed it, over time, was the specific quality of attention they each brought to observing the other in actual operation. She watched him handle situations that would have tested most people beyond their capacity. Political pressures, military crises, the ongoing complicated work of building a Jedi Order from scratch without a template, the personal weight of being simultaneously a symbol and a person. And she watched him handle all of it without losing the quality of genuine engagement that had unsettled her from the beginning. He didn't become remote under pressure. He didn't manage situations from a controlled distance. He stayed present, stayed human, stayed genuinely interested in the people around him, even when everything around him was demanding that he be a figurehead rather than a person. She found this, the longer she observed it, not irritating, but admirable. The irritation had been a younger response, the defensive reaction of someone who found his ease with openness confronting, because it illuminated everything she didn't yet have access to in herself. From the other side of her praxium work, from the vantage point of someone who had done serious interior excavation and understood better now what openness actually cost, she could see what he was doing clearly. She could see the choice it was, the daily, renewable, quietly effortful choice to remain available to the people and situations in front of him, rather than retreating into the safety of distance. He watched her develop in parallel ways over the same period, and what he observed was not a student becoming capable, but someone who had always been capable, discovering, slowly and at significant cost, what the capability was actually for. He watched the walls come down. Not all of them, not quickly, but enough that he could see, in the Force and in the ordinary human way, the person underneath them with increasing clarity. He watched her choose, repeatedly, to stay in the difficult internal work long after most people would have found a reason to stop. He watched her form relationships she clearly hadn't known how to form before, and handle the vulnerability of those relationships with an imperfect and genuine effort that he found, over time, one of the most honest things he had ever observed in another person. Trust built the way it builds between serious people through demonstrated reliability across situations that actually tested it, not through declarations, not through grand gestures, through the accumulation of instances where each of them had been under real pressure and the other had been exactly what the situation required, and where the accounting of these instances had become, over time, a record too consistent to dismiss. There were complications. This is not the kind of story that reaches the point of trust without complications, and pretending otherwise would be a disservice to the actual texture of what they navigated. Her history was not something that could be set aside like a professional credential she no longer needed. The years of imperial service, the things she had done in those years, the specific shape of the moral ledger she carried, these were real, and they were part of the relationship in the same way that any serious person's history is part of any serious relationship. Not as obstacles, exactly, as weight, the kind that doesn't go away but can, with the right kind of sustained honesty, be distributed rather than borne alone. She was not easy to be with. She would be the first to say so, and she has said so. In the characteristically unsparing way, she applies honest assessment to herself as readily as she applies it to everything else. She was demanding, not in the petulant way of someone expecting to be accommodated, but in the precise way of someone who had very high standards for the quality of engagement she offered and expected comparable quality in return. She was not gentle with comfortable illusions. If she thought something was wrong, she said so, directly, and without the social lubrication that makes directness easier to receive. If she disagreed fully, with the complete argumentative force of someone who had never learned to soften a position for the sake of another person's comfort. He was, to her consistent and occasionally exasperated observation, almost impossible to genuinely argue with. Not because he capitulated, he didn't. When he believed he was right, he was as committed to his position as anyone she had encountered. But because his manner of holding a position, even a firmly held one, had none of the defensive architecture that makes disagreement combative rather than productive. He engaged her arguments as arguments rather than as challenges to be defeated. He changed his mind when she made a case worth changing his mind about, and he did so without the performance of reluctance that most people require when publicly revising a position. He was, in the most fundamental sense, actually interested in being right more than he was interested in being right from the beginning. This was, she eventually concluded, one of the most genuinely rare qualities she had encountered in another person. She had worked with extremely capable people across her career. She had observed strategic intelligence and tactical brilliance and emotional sophistication in various combinations. But the specific combination of confidence and genuine intellectual openness that he operated with was something she hadn't encountered elsewhere, and she found it, over time, one of the things about him she valued most and was least inclined to discuss openly. The shift from the respect and the working trust and the complicated regard of two people who knew each other's capacity and limitations with unusual precision into something that required a different vocabulary was not a single event. She has been clear about this in the rare accounts she has given, and he has confirmed it in his. There was no moment of declaration, no scene with a clear before and after. There was a long middle period in which the relationship was what it was. Close, substantive, occasionally difficult, deeply honest, operating at a level of mutual regard that neither of them had named and both of them were aware of. And then, at some point along the way, it had become something else. And the something else had clearly been building for long enough that when they finally addressed it directly, the addressing had the quality of acknowledging something that was already entirely true, rather than deciding something that had previously been uncertain. She has described the conversation in the compressed and typically understated way she describes personal things, as the least surprising, important conversation she has ever had. She knew what she felt. She had known for longer than she'd been comfortable admitting. What she hadn't been certain of, and this is the part that her history made genuinely difficult to assess, was whether what she felt was actually hers, or whether it was another version of the pattern she had spent years excavating and dismantling. Another attachment formed in response to someone who had been powerful in her life in a formative way. She had done enough interior work by the time this question became urgent to examine it seriously. She examined it seriously What she found, looking at it with the same unflinching honesty she had applied to every other aspect of herself during the Praxium years, was that it was hers. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly, without anyone else's design underneath it, hers. It had the texture of chosen things. It had the weight of her own judgment, her own values, her own accumulated understanding of what she actually wanted in another person after years of having no framework for wanting anything for herself. He was someone she had chosen, not because of what he represented, not because of his force sensitivity, or his institutional significance, or the specific role he had played in the excavation of her interior life, but because of who he was, specifically, in all the complicated and ordinary and extraordinary ways she had come to know over years of genuine attention. That was the foundation. Everything built on top of it was built on that. They were married in a ceremony that was, by all accounts, characteristically theirs, small, without unnecessary ceremony, attended by the people who had actually been present for the process of them becoming who they were, rather than the people the galaxy thought should be invited to the wedding of two significant Jedi. She wore something practical. He was not late, which she had not entirely expected. Someone who knew them both well enough said afterward that the thing most striking about the ceremony was how unsurprised everyone present seemed, as if the event was not a beginning, but a ratification of something that had clearly already been true for some time. What followed the ceremony was not a simple life. Nothing about either of their lives had been simple, and marriage did not change the fundamental nature of the galaxy they were operating in. There were missions and crises, and the ongoing complicated work of building something durable in a galaxy that kept generating new reasons for instability. There were disagreements that were genuinely hard and required the full weight of everything they had built between them to navigate without damage. There were losses because the galaxy in this era was not kind about losses, and they were not insulated from them. But there was also this: two people who had found each other through the specific and improbable path of a death order and a 5-year orbit, and years of difficult interior work and the slow accumulation of genuine regard, who had built something honest between them, something that held its shape under real pressure, something that was theirs in the complete sense that only chosen things can be. She had a son, Ben, named for a man who had been a bridge between eras, a name that carried the weight of the tradition they were both, in different ways, trying to preserve and rebuild. She loved him with the specific intensity of someone who had never been loved that way as a child, and understood in her bones what it meant to give a child the thing she had not been given, a framework that belonged to them, a self that was theirs before anyone tried to shape it into something else. She was not a perfect mother. She has never claimed to be. She brought to parenting the same unsentimental honesty she brought to everything, the same high standards, the same directness, the same occasional difficulty with the kind of softness that requires you to be less than fully honest for the sake of someone's immediate comfort. But she was present, genuinely, fully, unreservedly present in the way that she had never been permitted to experience anyone being present for her. That was what she gave him, her presence. The full weight of her attention turned toward his actual life, rather than a version of him she had decided on in advance. The galaxy did not, of course, leave them alone. It never does, for people of their capability and their institutional position, in an era of ongoing instability. They operated through the years that followed the marriage as the complete partnership they had always been building toward, each of them more capable in combination than they were separately, not because they were identical, but because they weren't. Her precision and his openness, her directness and his patience, Her ability to see the shape of a threat before it became visible, and his ability to remain present with the human dimensions of situations that required both analysis and compassion. People who worked with them during this period described something that is difficult to articulate clearly, but consistently remarked upon. A quality of alignment between them that wasn't merger and wasn't agreement, and wasn't the kind of unified front that some partnerships maintain by suppressing internal difference. It was something more like resonance, two separate instruments, playing different parts, producing something together that neither could produce alone. She would have rolled her eyes at the musical metaphor. He would have found it exactly right. That gap too was part of what made them work. The final chapter holds her whole life up to the light. What it cost, what it built, and what it means that a person the galaxy was never supposed to know existed, became, in the end, someone the galaxy could not have done without. The galaxy remembers her now. That is perhaps the most quietly remarkable thing about the full arc of her story. That a person built to be invisible, trained from childhood to leave no impression that hadn't been deliberately authorized, ended up mattering to the history of her era in ways that could not be erased and were not. The records that were purged after Endor are still gone. The imperial files that might have documented her early service, the coded manifests of the Emperor's shadow program, the mission logs of a decade and a half of assignments nobody officially remembers. All of it remains absent. The erasure held, as erasures often do, for the narrow purpose it was designed for. It removed her from the official history of the empire she had served. It did not remove her from the actual history of the galaxy she had lived in. Those are different archives, kept in different places, and the people who maintain them are harder to reach than Imperial intelligence ever managed to be. What does it mean to hold a life like hers up to the light? Not to assess it, not to render a verdict on the things she did in service of a man who used people as instruments and called it purpose, but simply to look at it, the full shape of it, from the child taken before she could refuse to the Jedi Master, who helped rebuild a tradition the Emperor had tried to destroy, and understand what it actually was. It was not a tragedy. The tragic reading is available, and it is not dishonest. There is real loss in her story, real damage done early that could not be entirely undone, real cost attached to every stage of the becoming, a childhood that belonged to someone else's design, years of service that filled a ledger she was never meant to examine, the specific grief of understanding in middle life, what had been taken before she was old enough to protect it. These things are in the story. They do not disappear because the story continued past them. But tragedy requires that the loss be final, that the damage be definitive, that the person at the center of the story be in the end more shaped by what was done to them than by what they chose to do with what remained. And that is not what happened here. What happened here was something more complicated and in its way more true to how lives actually work when people refuse to be only what they were made to be. She chose. That is the word the story keeps returning to, across every chapter of it, in every context where it matters. She chose to examine the last command rather than simply execute it. She chose to approach Skywalker for help when every instinct built into her by decades of training said that asking for help was vulnerability, and vulnerability was unacceptable. She chose to stay in the Praxium work through the sessions that produced nothing but a more precise understanding of how deep the problem went. She chose the relationships she built, the life she constructed, the person she became on the other side of the excavation. These choices were not made easily or quickly, or without the full weight of her history, making each one harder than it would have been for someone who hadn't been built to resist them. Jian, they were made in the specific and difficult way of someone who understood what the choosing cost and did it anyway, because she had arrived at a place where she understood that the alternative was more costly still. This is what her story means. Not that the damage can always be undone, not that survival is the same as healing, but that the capacity to choose does not require the absence of damage. It requires only that something remain, some thread, some persistent and unkillable quality of self, that the conditioning and the service and the years of living inside someone else's design could not quite reach. In her case, that thread was curiosity, the simple, irreducible, apparently indestructible fact of her genuine interest in the lives of other people. It sounds like too small a thing to be the foundation of a rescue, but it was exactly that. It was the thing that made the excavation possible, because you cannot find your way back to yourself through the Force, or through relationship, or through the slow, honest work of becoming, if you don't have some fundamental orientation toward the world and the people in it that remains your own. She reached Jedi Master through a path unlike any other in the history of the Order that Skywalker built. The old Order had produced masters through decades of formal training, through the accumulated wisdom of a tradition that stretched back thousands of years, through the institutional recognition of a council that had the authority to confer the title and the history to make the conferral meaningful. None of that was available to the new Jedi Order in its early years. Skywalker was building the tradition and producing masters simultaneously, which meant that the title, when it was conferred on her, carried the weight of something assessed rather than assumed. What qualified her was not the technical capability, though the technical capability was genuine and deep. It was not the years of experience, though experience was present in abundance. What qualified her was the specific combination of who she was and what she had done with who she was. The integration of extraordinary capability with hard-won self-knowledge, the ability to work with students who had damage built into their architecture, because she understood that architecture from the inside. The quality of presence she brought to teaching that was the direct product of having learned at significant cost, just to be actually present rather than operationally present. She was a teacher. This is the thing that surprised people who encountered her primarily through the reputation of her imperial years, who expected the former emperor's hand to be a certain kind of Jedi, precise and demanding and oriented toward the combat and strategic dimensions of the tradition. She was those things. She was also, unexpectedly and genuinely, someone who understood the interior work of becoming a Jedi better than almost anyone else in the Order, because she had done it later than most, under harder conditions, with more to dismantle and less institutional support than any conventional student had ever faced. She could see her students, not just their capability profiles, not just their force sensitivity ratings, not just the technical dimensions of what they needed to learn. She could see them, the specific shape of their damage and their gifts, and the gap between what they were and what they were trying to become. She knew how to work with that gap without either minimizing it or making it the only thing she saw. She knew how to stay present with difficulty without either managing it toward a faster resolution or drowning in it. She knew this because someone had done it for her, because Skywalker had seen her with exactly that quality of attention in the years when she most needed to be seen, and had refused to convert her into a project or a symbol or anything other than a specific person he was trying to help. She passed this forward, not as a technique she had been taught, but as a way of being with students that came from the genuine understanding of what it had meant in her own life to receive it. The Yuuzhan Vong War arrived with a brutality that the galaxy had not encountered before. Not an internal conflict, not a political rupture, not the kind of war that reorganizes power structures while leaving the fundamental nature of the civilization intact. An invasion from outside the known galaxy, prosecuted by a species that existed outside the Force entirely, and used organic technology of a kind that the New Republic's military doctrine had no framework for countering. It was the kind of crisis that doesn't just test existing institutions, it reveals with absolute clarity which ones were actually built to hold and which ones were held together by assumptions that no longer applied. She operated through the Vong War with the full range of everything she was, the Jedi Master with the institutional understanding of the Order's role and limitations, the former Imperial operative with the strategic clarity to read large-scale military situations without the political filters that complicated the New Republic's military assessments. The person who had spent a lifetime navigating morally complicated situations and had developed through that navigation a quality of ethical judgment that didn't require clean options to function. She was present in situations during the Vong War that have not been fully documented and probably cannot be. The kind of situations that wars of that scale and that character produce, where the available choices are all costly, and the question is only which cost is acceptable. She made decisions in those situations that she has not fully discussed and that those who were present have not fully described. The available evidence suggests they were the decisions of someone who had done the interior work required to act with clarity under conditions that would have broken a less integrated person. She was not broken. She was tested in the specific and unsparing way that genuine crisis tests people, and she held. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without carrying things afterward that she would continue to carry, but she held. The structure that had been built, piece by chosen piece, over the years since Endor, the structure that was hers, that no one had installed in her, that she had excavated and constructed and maintained through everything, held. This was, in the accumulated account of her life, one of the things that mattered most. Not the holding in the easy times, the holding under conditions designed by reality to find every weakness in a person's architecture and press on it until something gave. She had an architecture built by her own choices, tested against the worst the galaxy produced, and it did not give. Ben grew up with 2 Jedi Masters for parents and all the complications that implies. He was loved. That was the foundation of everything else. The uncomplicated, fully committed love of 2 people who had not been permitted to be loved that way themselves and understood, with a clarity that came from absence, exactly what they were giving and what it meant to give it. He was also raised by people who were honest about the galaxy, who did not protect him from the knowledge of what the world contained or the complexity of the choices it would require. She would not have known how to raise a child in comfortable illusions, even if she had believed that was the right approach. It wasn't the approach. The approach was to give him the truth and the capability to live inside it with his eyes open. This was, in the retrospective accounting of people who knew them during Ben's childhood, both the gift and the complication. A child raised with full honesty about the galaxy and full love from the people raising him has significant advantages over a child raised with only one of those things. He also has to carry, from early on, the weight of a reality that most children are protected from until they are older. Whether the balance was right, whether they gave him what he needed in the proportions he needed it, is the kind of question that parents in any era can never fully answer. And she knew this, and she carried it with the same unflinching attention she brought to every other piece of her life. She was not a perfect mother. She was a present one. And the difference between those 2 things was, in her own history, the most significant difference she knew. The end came during the Vong War, at a point in the conflict when the galaxy's capacity for loss had already been tested past anything most people had thought survivable. It came not from the Vong, which is one of the details that has made it harder, not easier, to understand in the years since. It came from within, from a direction that the people who loved her had not anticipated and could not have defended against with any of the defenses available to them. She was killed by Jason Solo, nephew of her husband, child of people she had known for decades, a young man who had been moving toward a darkness that the people closest to him had seen coming but had been unable to turn. The killing was deliberate. It was the act of someone who had made a choice that placed him beyond the framework of the order and the relationships that had previously organized his life. It was, in the most direct sense, a betrayal of the tradition, of the people who had invested in him, of everything that the galaxy's Jedi had tried to build in the years since Endor. She did not die easily or without resistance. She died in the specific manner of someone who had spent a lifetime learning not to go anywhere, without understanding exactly where she was and what was in the room with her, which means she understood what was happening. She understood it clearly and without the protection of disbelief. She was a Jedi Master in the fullest sense when it happened. She was Mara Jade Skywalker in the fullest sense of all of that name required. The grief that followed was real, and it was large, and it belongs to people who are not this story's subject to carry it in whatever way they carry it. What belongs to this story is what her death revealed about her life, which is, as deaths sometimes do, when they come for people who have genuinely lived, the full outline of what had been built. She had been designed to be invisible. She designed to move through the world without impression, without record, without the kind of presence that people notice and carry forward in their own lives. The Emperor had built her for function and erasure, useful while needed, gone when not, leaving nothing behind that could be traced back to him or to the machinery she had been part of. What she actually left behind was people, specific, particular people whose lives had been shaped by contact with her. Students who had become Jedi through a kind of teaching they couldn't have received from anyone without her particular history. Colleagues who had been seen by her in the specific way she saw people and had never quite gotten over it. A son who had been loved with the full force of everything she had learned about what love actually requires. A husband whose understanding of himself and his work had been sharpened and deepened by decades of her honest engagement with both. This is what the erasure failed to account for. You can purge the files. You can overwrite the mission logs. You can remove a name from every official record it was ever entered in. What you cannot remove is the way a person's presence ripples forward through the people they touched, the specific quality of their attention, passed forward through the students they taught, and the relationships they built, becoming part of the living texture of a tradition and a world that carries it forward without necessarily knowing where it came from. She had been designed to leave no trace. She left traces everywhere. What is the honest, complete accounting of a life like hers? Not the Imperial years alone, which would make it a story about damage. Not the Jedi years alone, which would make it a story about redemption. Both of those framings are too clean. They require the selection of certain chapters over others, the arrangement of the evidence toward a predetermined conclusion that the full life doesn't actually support. The full life was this: a person who was made into an instrument before she could consent to being made into anything, who survived the dismantling of the only framework she had ever known, who carried a dead man's fury through years of unglamorous survival without being consumed by it, who chose, actively repeatedly at significant cost, to do the work of becoming herself, rather than simply maintaining the architecture she'd been given, who loved people genuinely, with the full and sometimes uncomfortable intensity of someone who had learned what love was by understanding its absence, who was difficult and excellent and honest in ways that were not always comfortable and did not become less honest as she became more comfortable, who built things that lasted, relationships, a practice, a way of being in the force that her students carried forward, a family that existed because she had decided at some point in the complicated middle of her life that she was allowed to want one. She was never just a hand. She was never just the Emperor's instrument, or the last command, or the woman with a death order she didn't complete, or the student who arrived already forged, or the master who taught from the inside of her own damage. She was all of those things, and more than all of them. A person. She fully and finally and irreducibly a person who had been given every reason to be less than that and had refused. The galaxy had not been meant to know her name. It knows it now. And what it knows, held up to the light of the full account, is something worth knowing. The story of someone who proved, in the specific and unspectacular and absolutely essential way, that only a lived life can prove anything. That what is built into you is not the final word on what you become. She chose. She built. She loved. She held. And the galaxy, whether it knew it or not, was better for every year she was in it. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself still awake at the end of it, carried forward by a life the galaxy was never supposed to know, then share it with someone who needs a reason to keep going. Not because the story is comfortable, because it's true. And true things, told honestly, have a way of finding the people who need them most. Mara Jade Skywalker, Emperor's Hand, Jedi Master, agent of her own story. She was never just a hand.